All right, so we'll be shortly switching over to the live Q&A session. If anybody would like to ask any additional questions, please submit them through the live chat. Um, right before we start that, we're actually going to introduce, well, first of all, if anybody would like to order some excellent meat from Gunthorp Farms, it's at gunthorpfarms.com, and I can personally vow that it is just excellent. So definitely go check them out if you're into more sustainably raised product. They have pristine products. So next we're going to bring in Monica Brooks. She is a co-founder of Concerned Citizens Against Industrial CAFOs, founding member of Sentinels of Eastern Shore Health, and joins Dr. Robert Lawrence as a member of Socially Responsible Agricultural Project. Monica was instrumental in stopping a 13-house CAFO project on the Lower Eastern Shore, and we'd like to hear a little bit from her. Could you update us on what's happening, Monica? All right, looks like Monica's having some issues on the other end, so we're going to move forward. This first question is going to be directed to Dr. Lawrence. I recently learned that the American Public Health Association has developed a position statement on CAFOs. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, Dr. Lawrence? You're just going to want to unmute your mic just as a reminder.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yes, the American Public Health Association is actually the largest public health association in the world outside of WHO. It has members all over North America, predominantly US and Canada, but some from Mexico as well. And it looks at all aspects of risk factors for the health of the American people. In 2012, a moratorium proposal was introduced by a group of us within APHA. The Center for a Livable Future helped draft language for that. And it called for a temporary halt on new construction while research was done on the public health impacts of CAFOs. There were already sufficient impacts, in my view, to have called for an outright moratorium. Now in November last year, 2019, a revised moratorium that calls on no further construction and no further expansion of existing CAFOs because of their proven public health impacts. And Sacoby Wilson mentioned a bunch of those. I did in my interview as well. But the three main elements of the APHA moratorium are to, one, remove industrial agriculture from exemptions for enforcement of environmental laws. Reporting laws about emissions and so forth have been exempt, providing a special protection for the industrialization and consolidation of food animal production. The second thing is to enforce the Clean Air Act, and that addresses the emission of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide and all the other contaminants that are responsible for the high rates of asthma and respiratory disease. Again, that Sacoby and I both referenced in our comments. And then the third calls upon the US government to totally ban the use of medically important antibiotics in healthy animals. This means no more growth promotion, no more disease prevention or prophylactic use of antibiotics that are important in treating human patients, and also important in treating sick animals. So it would be good for veterinarians as well as physicians in terms of the interests of their patients. So the moratorium has passed. It's in effect, but it has been overwhelmed by recent events. But I think the last comments that Greg was making about the fragility of our current meat supply that's been exposed by the COVID-19 epidemic means that as things begin to clarify even more, we have this opportunity to take advantage of the weaknesses of our current reliance on CAFO-produced animal products to really give some momentum to the APHA moratorium.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. So our next question is from Kathy Phillips, directed towards Dr. Wilson. Maryland has a commission that is supposed to address environmental justice pressures on impacted communities. Why isn't this commission an integral part of the state permitting process for these polluting industries by reviewing the cumulative impacts of the pollutants being emitted by these industries, applying for clean water permits and air permits? Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you for that question. I think the commission was founded, I think 2 decades ago, and I think originally it had a really good purpose, but I believe the commission has failed in the areas of environmental justice, in the areas of public health, in really addressing the concerns of frontline and fence line communities. My critique of the commission has really been around not having representation of community members who are impacted by environmental justice issues in the state of Maryland. For this conversation, I would say there's not authentic representation on that commission from individuals who actually come from a frontline, fence line community near chicken farms. And to me, that's a travesty, because we know of the disproportionate impacts these operations have on human health, on the environment, on economics, right, of those communities. It's already been said by others. I'm just kind of reiterate. Think about the impacts on water quality. You have folks in Salisbury, NWP, who are fighting a chicken farm for being sited on the Paleo Channel, the primary water supply for that area. You have folks who've been impacted by air quality impacts, right? So whether it be ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, particulate matter, VOCs, you have the nitrates, you have the, bacteria. MDE has failed. This commission has failed to protect those communities. There's a current agreement between MDE, the Chicken Board and Chicken Council, and the foundation, and they're doing studies to collect data on air quality impacts. They're using some data from air quality monitors in Baltimore. That makes no sense. The rural makeup of pollution associated with chicken farms is very different than the urban makeup of pollution from mobile and stationary pollution sources. If you're going to do that kind of study, you should have citizen science. You should have community engagement. It should be community driven. You should have monitors in people's homes. You should have monitors at spatial gradient for the facilities. We should have on-site access to facilities to be able to understand the levels of pollutants at those sites. So MDE and this commission, time and time again, have dropped the ball. They try to re-adjudicate what is environmental justice, and they're not listening to the voices of the people. So I think there's certain things that need to be done to make this right. This commission should be rechartered. That's one start. This commission should be required to have more representation of folks who are fence line and front line. This commission should get some real power to do something. What they've been doing is a commission, it's a talking commission and not a doing commission. So there's a lot more I want to say about it, but respect to the other folks on the panel, and also the folks who are listening who have questions, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Sacoby. Dr. Wilson. So this next question is not directed towards anybody in particular. This is from August Balin. Is there a way that we can work towards switching CAFO models to plant-based models? And anyone that wants to take a stab at that, please feel free.
Michael, it's Greg. Can I say something?
Please.
Sure. The only thing I would say is that I always like to caution people. First of all, I'll say that I think our society does eat too much meat. I actually offend both sides because I offend my friends that are livestock and poultry producers. We eat about 200 pounds of meat per person in the United States. It's but 90, 70, and 60 pounds of chicken, beef, and pork per person per year, and that's too much. But as we shift to eating less, we should eat better. But I do not think that shift should be to highly industrialized, patented, plant-based alternatives. We should eat more plants. But we should eat plants in the form that they come out of the ground, not some form that some corporation with huge patents and huge amount of technology turns them into something that looks like meat.
Yes, sir. Let me jump in real quick on that. And just to follow up on that point, I early on in the year, I participated in a vegan challenge as a way to educate myself on veganism and really, be more about, I talk about social justice, environmental justice, trying to live it out more in a different way. And I appreciate what was just said because, and getting to Dr. Lawrence's comments, the food system is broken, okay? The food system is broken. We have many communities that I work in that are dealing, I talk about food swamps and food deserts, they're dealing with food apartheid. We need to be figuring out how we get to food sovereignty. So urban agriculture, slow food movements, regenerative agriculture. How can we bring that farms to the people, right? How can we, change the way we grow food, produce food? So whether it be animals, whether it be plants, I agree we should have more plant-based diets, but I think you have to look at the issue of equity and justice. Yes, we want to make sure people eat more plants, but what about access to those resources? Financially, a lot of folks don't have the resources, don't have the money to pay for food now. So you have to, if you're going to do that, we have to make sure equity is in that discussion from the beginning to make sure we have better food opportunity structures and better food security for many folks who rely on high caloric foods, who may be eating more meats that are lower quality. That's a social justice issue, and that has to be put on the table.
Yeah, I wanted to let Greg in particular weigh in on this before I did here. But I think it's a matter of looking and most of the problems we see with eating meat now are associated with kind of the industrial food system. And my whole focus is on creating a sustainable agriculture. That means a regenerative agriculture, resilient agriculture, resourceful agriculture that's efficient, that meets the needs of people, and that has to be low-income people, all of the people. And so I think we have to focus on those broad issues. Now, I think the way you create a regenerative, sustainable agriculture that's also resilient, resourceful, is we look at nature at the model. The whole industrial system is saying we're basically going to break free of nature and we're going to produce what we want to produce wherever we want to produce it, and we will make nature kind of give in to us and give us what we want. But if you look at how we work in harmony with nature in order to, so we fit in with that, and we're healthy people within a healthy natural ecosystem and so on. I think if you look at any healthy natural ecosystem, it's a diverse system that has something within that system that functions or serves the same function as animal agriculture does for the human component of that overall system, whether it's earthworms or things in the soil or insects or various other things. There's always things in that system that will process some some component of that biological system, and we'll turn it into food and turn it into waste, and the waste from that particular organism then will feed the living things within that organism. And so I think if you look at a healthy living system, I think we would find that there will be animal agriculture within a healthy food system for healthy human beings. Now, I would agree that it's probably going to be far fewer animals, and we're going to be eating less meat, milk, and eggs than we do now, because we kind of distorted the natural system in order to produce more of those things simply because we wanted to. But I think we need to look at that system. And another thing I think people, within the animal rights, animal welfare movement, I think everybody's in favor of animal welfare that cures anything about sustainability, because we and those animals are part of the same system. We need to treat those animals with dignity and respect. But at the same time, we have to realize that we as biological beings are like all other biological beings, and every biological thing lives by eating the flesh or what could have supported another living thing. So whether you're eating plants or whether you're eating animals, you're eating something that was alive. And we, like the other species out here, we don't necessarily wait for all those once living things to die before we eat them. But there's plenty of other animals and plenty of other things out there that do the same thing. I think we become more sensitive to this whole idea that you have to kill or deprive something of life in order to live as a part of a natural living system. We become more sensitive to that the more those other living things look like us. And just because a plant or a carrot or whatever doesn't look like us, we need to have respect for life in everything we do, and we need to treat that life with respect. But I think we need to have respect for nature. And as far as the scientific studies that I've read that deals with, the negative environmental impacts, climate change impacts, health impacts that are associated with CAFOs and with with animal agriculture looking into the future, they're always looking at the industrial system of animal agriculture and say, if we tinker with it a little bit here and there, basically if we make it more efficient, if we produce more meat with less food, less feed, take less acres to produce it on, with fewer breeding animals, we get bigger animals, then the systems that they're comparing then to the plant-based systems are just modified versions of industrial agriculture, and not the kind of systems that we're talking about moving to, because those systems don't exist yet. And so I just think we need to be a lot more thoughtful and think deeper about these issues. I'm not arguing with the fact that we probably end up eating less meat, but if we get all carried away with eating vegetables or something else, we may find out that was a big mistake also, and then we'll have to correct that later. So let's just figure out how we can work with nature, and like any other species, we'll attempt to tip nature, the balance of nature in our favor relative to other species, but we have to be careful not to tip it too far or too fast, or we'll destroy that system that we're a part of, and we'll destroy us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Let me add, Michael, one other quick thing here, and that is that I do think that John's point about comparing industrially produced meat with a vegetarian diet is inappropriate. However, the feed conversion ratio and the carbon footprint adding to the climate crisis have to be addressed. And certainly there are enormous impacts that come from a high meat diet. But the other part of switching to predominantly plant-based and grain-based foods for low income and lower middle income populations is the fact that we enjoy in the United States the luxury of high quality sources of plant protein. And that's no longer true in many parts of the world. So nutritional stunting from the lack of quality protein is an enormous problem. Over 35 million children in the world today are nutritionally stunted because they do not get enough protein. So if we could provide 2 or 3 eggs a week for every child in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, or the equivalent in high quality animal protein in some other form, that would be an enormous public health advance. But we also do have compelling data, as I mentioned, about the efficacy of the Mediterranean diet, which is not a vegetarian diet. It's a flexitarian diet, but it does dramatically reduce the amount of animal protein consumed and increases the reliance on quality vegetable proteins.
I got to add something real quick because I've already said enough, but we can't rely on the markets to feed hungry people, to feed poor people, because most of the people that are hungry because they're poor. The markets are never going to feed the poor. We've been burning up 40% of our corn crop in our automobiles rather than producing food for hungry people. And we've always had a surplus of food in this country, but we don't put it to hungry people. We just got to take on that problem in a different way. I proposed a whole bunch of things, you know, like community food utilities, where we just take the responsibility on directly and say we're going to meet the basic food needs of everyone. Food sovereignty, you mentioned, Sacoby, there's a whole global movement that says it's a basic human right to have enough nutritious, safe, nutritious, culturally appropriate food for everyone. The new Green Deal says it's a basic human right to have safe, wholesome, nutritious food. We just got to get that out of the market and forget about trying to feed people by making food cheap.
Thank you, Dr. Ikerd. I'm going to backtrack a couple of minutes here to Dr. Wilson's earlier response on this very question. This actually comes from August again, and she says, due to Mr. Wilson's response, which is great, what are ways that we can build those bridges in the lower income neighborhoods to provide plant-based foods and make plant-based foods accessible to POC in these neighborhoods, people of color?
Oh, you know, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, Dr. Ikerd just hit on it a little bit. I mean, I think for me, and let me give me a couple seconds to frame this the right way. As someone who is a descendant of you know, enslaved Africans, right? You know, someone who's from Mississippi, whose family was sharecroppers. In my family, there's a lot of pain and anguish associated with the land. You know, a lot of folks, the exodus from the South to cities, you know, in the 20s and the 30s, people left the land. They wanted to stop connections with the land. Not saying I'm going to broad brush when it comes to Black folks and people of color, but that trauma, that pain, I think is part of this disconnect with the land. And I think what we need to be able to do is, and this Dr. Ikerd thing hit on this a little bit, is this cultural wellness in the land. One thing I like to say is, for a lot of folks who are disconnected from the land or disconnected from their air property, you know, Black folks of the African diaspora were master agriculturalists before slavery. Our history did not begin with slavery, right? And so for me, you gotta understand land, the connection, land is power, land is wealth, land is community, land is history, land is legacy. So I think to get folks to get reconnected to land, food is a part of it, but really saying that we are part of the land. We are part of nature, and that trauma has to be addressed. Just like we talk about racial trauma right now, George Floyd, Arbery, and others, the trauma of slavery, the trauma of sharecropping, you know, the fact that in many communities of color, you have parks that they don't access because the parks weren't built for them, right? We got disproportionate access to parks, but an underutilization of parks. So how do we reconnect folks to land? How do we use land as part of culture? How do we reconnect people to nature? How do we see power, you know, and wellness in that? I think that's part of what needs to happen so folks that see land as something that's useful, to see nature as something that they are connected to. And so urban agriculture is an important way to do that. Educational programs, it's really holistic community building, right? Holistic community building, and using land as the central part of that. You know, urban forestry, you know, there's so many benefits to land. There's so many benefits to nature that we have to, and again, not to broad brush, because many folks of color are already doing this, but expanding that work that they're doing, bringing that work to other people, the work of permaculture as well. So a lot of folks are already highly activated in the space, but expanding those opportunities, expand those discussions that talk about land and nature and our connections to it and the cultural wellness that comes from those connections. And I'll stop there. Thanks for the question.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So Monica Brooks was having some difficulties earlier, a couple technical difficulties, but we've got her back on now as a panelist. And just to remind you all, she was successful in, her group was successful in stopping a 13-house CAFO from coming into the Lower Eastern Shore. Monica, can you give us an update on what's happening with all this now?
Yeah, sure. Can everyone hear me now?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Great. So one of the things I want to kind of give a little tiny bit of background. This area of the Eastern Shore, which I moved to, I transplanted here. And it was interesting to find out the history, and we have here Harriet Tubman, her home, the Underground Railroad. It was a huge slave port in this area. And so many people of color worked in factories. There was not a lot of land ownership. There's just a lot of things in background. And so fast forward to current day, when I began fighting this CAFO fight, I remember someone saying to me, "Oh, you went to college?" Really? Yes, I did. And so did my parents. Really? And even standing in front of my first county council, addressing them about CAFOs, I had someone come up to me and say, "You know, I was very impressed that you could stand up in front of all those white men and make your comment." Now, this is just a few years ago. So my point is that here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, we have a lot of thinking that is antiquated and that is just completely lost. And so when you talk about an area that still has that sort of mentality, you have to understand that there are disparages in economics, wealth, and health for people of color. Wycomico County is about 25% African American. However, that particular CAFO that we were successfully able to stop was in an area that was 83% African American. So, and as was Dr. Wilson mentioned earlier, it was actually meant to be on top of the Paleo Channel, which is our source of water. So again, you know, we have issues here that are ingrained racially that have to be altered and changed. People need to get educated. And so what we're doing here is trying to educate people. One of the things even mentioned earlier about the plant-based and the food deserts, you know, trying to get people connected to where your food comes from, even in a rural community. There are people that still don't know certain things, or they think just because it comes out of the ground that Dr. Ikerd was saying, it's healthy. So there are so many things that we're trying to do here to educate people, and even dealing, you know, learning that in our country, we've lost so many Black farmers. I mean, Black farmers we used to have almost 1 million Black farmers. Now we have about 40,000 in the US. And of those 40,000, not all of them even own the land that they're working on, you know. And here we've been dealing with the COVID-19 in our factories. So many people of color and immigrants working in these poultry factories that have gotten COVID. And we find out that Purdue, Tyson, all of these companies were complicit in these workers getting these diseases. But then I find out that a member of Purdue was slated to be on this commission for environmental justice for the people. And I'm thinking, how does that work? this whole mentality of if you have money, if you have resources, you have power, you have connection, then you basically can choose and pick whatever you want. However, we've had multiple instances here where the people themselves are not integrated into decision making. As many times as we've gone to Senate hearings, to House hearings, to speak to the governor, it just looks like money talks. And as I said to our governor before, which I've mentioned this on before, is, why do you want to put all of our eggs in one basket? I mean, it makes absolutely no sense for us to be in this position where people are still fighting. We had food lines for basic services during COVID, and there's still not a lot of access to meat, but we have 4 major poultry companies within an hour and a half of here, and we still had long lines. And responses were, oh, but we did stuff, we helped people. So we have a ways to go. One of the things is deprogramming people to this idea that if I don't work in poultry, maybe I'm not going to make it, or those are the only jobs here. Diversity. I've been talking to our county councils and our executives about, increasing diversity of jobs, and it's a constant push. But you push past the lack of understanding, and you push past people's misconceptions of who they think you are, and you push past the ignorance so that people can thrive. We have the highest rates of asthma in middle school students, and we have the highest respiratory rates in the whole state. Our poorest county in the whole state of Maryland is Somerset County, Maryland, which almost half of the population is African American. And they have the most CAFOs in the whole state of Maryland, and it's the poorest county. So there are a lot of things. And so we're working here to encourage voting, getting people pushed out of office, making demands, and certainly during this time when more eyes are open, more ears are open, and there's more receptive. We're pushing for environmental justice issues, pushing against environmental racism. There's no reason why in 2020 a family should be harassed by poultry people, okay, threatened, attacked, and when you go to the police, they said, you know what, I think you just need to get this family out of town. What? Excuse me? So there are too many threads that are showing that people in general, companies are showing that people don't matter, but specifically, we're talking people of color really don't matter in this equation. So there are a lot of things, factors going on, and it's a multi-pronged approach, dealing with CATA, dealing with the immigrants and the workers, and concerned citizens, dealing with CAFOs, and NAACP working with lots of social justice, and we're combining to see a change on the Eastern Shore because it's long overdue.
Thank you, Monica. I know we were planned on wrapping this up at 8:30. I will keep taking questions. If any of the panelists have to get off, I do understand you all have busy schedules sometimes and whatnot. First of all, SRAP is the one that put this together with a couple of co-sponsors at Socially Responsible Agricultural Project. Their group working really hard to push the values that we're talking about here today, the important things such as sustainable farming, such as preserving the land and our practices of producing food. Really important work that they're doing out there. And if anybody would like to donate, there is a website, sraproject.org, and we can take donations there. It's a 501c3, and we would love to have your support. To continue, we would like to, the next question is going to be from Shelley Cohen. There's not so many things about CAFOs that are hard to understand, or there are so many things about CAFOs that are hard to understand. I don't understand the concept of applying animal or human waste to corn or other crops with the so-called high nitrate uptake. Please explain what seems to never be discussed, such as waste and its pathogens and pollutants polluting our groundwater, aquifers, or feeding those crops to the animals, which will be harvested to feed people, or feeding those same animals the OFFAL, which makes those same animals into cannibals. All of this enters into our food supply. How can any or all of this be safe to consume?
Listen.
If anyone wants to take a stab at that.
Well, I'll just quickly say something. We have a nitrogen overload here on the Eastern Shore, and so we already have a nitrate problem here, and this continued over processing of and adding this waste, that is not the answer. You cannot create a problem and then say, oh, I've got a solution so that I can make more and add to this problem, meaning manure to energy. So we're just going to turn manure into energy. That's our new save the day. But this is not what they're doing. Is even adding this waste and the pollutants, it does come at a price. It does come at a price. And so in certain areas, yes, it has been a practice, but it comes at a price. And but everyone's not doing it, although it's become a model, especially on areas like this in the Eastern Shore where there are lots of poultry, and people say, oh, well, I can just use all of that poultry waste and put it to good use on crops, and that's not the answer.
Well, I'll comment on the agricultural agronomic part of it. Greg probably knows some more. I think Bob Lawrence here know a lot more about the public health, maybe Sacoby would, so I don't want to speculate in that area. But when they talk about they're going to use this livestock manure, animal waste for fertilizer, and they talk about having regulations of, what they have in terms of the CAFOs have to meet in terms of the application, they have to have a certain amount of land spread at a certain rate. I think to begin with, you need to realize that those recommendations are based on agronomic practices, what would optimize or maximize the yield of the crop, not on ecological or environmental protection. And the amount that would go for an optimum economic application of fertilizer is significantly higher, as we've seen historically over time, over and over again, significantly higher than it would be if we're really focusing those regulations on environmental protection rather than agronomic rates of fertilization. Now, the other thing is they really don't stick to the agronomic rates. For example, they will go in and if you think about it in terms of particular the manure, the low cost of that, but let's just say commercial nitrogen that you're putting on a crop. In general, if nitrogen is the limiting element when you're increasing, let's say corn yields, because I know the figures in there, then if that's the limiting factor, if everything else is great except you're short on nitrogen, you add a pound of nitrogen, then you'll get about an extra bushel of corn. Well, nitrogen in general will run about 1/10 in terms of cost per pound to a bushel of corn in terms of 1/10 per pound, because it's the corn crop basically is driving the price of nitrogen. So what does that tell you? It says at an economic rate then that you would put on nitrogen at a level that you would expect to hit 1 year out of 10. Because if you hit it that 1 year out of 10, then you have just paid for that extra pound of nitrogen. The other 9 years, corn crop will have more than paid for the nitrogen. That says 9 out of 10 years, you have more nitrogen at the optimum economic rate. You have more nitrogen than that corn's going to be able to use. So that's the second factor. How much more depends on the variability of yield. Highly variable, you're going to put on more. And in those years where you don't hit the high yield, then that nitrogen is going to go off into the ground, leach into the groundwater, go off into the streams and various other things and be pollution. And then in addition to that, they don't even pay attention to the application rate. For one thing, if you haul particularly liquid manure, poultry litter is a little bit different. Once you get 3 or 4 miles from the plant, like if you've got a giant CAFO, if you're hauling liquid manure, the hauling cost is worth more than the value of the manure for fertilizer. So you end up, and they over apply close to the places, and they over apply in general. You know, it just goes on and on and on. You had a researcher here in Iowa that did research where he looked at, and they have the county data for 4 or 5 counties that have the most CAFOs up in the northwest area of the country. I forget how many counties, but they have data for that that shows how much fertilizer was applied. And he calculated how many CAFOs were in that area that would need to spread the manure. And he determined that they were applying enough commercial nitrogen fertilizer to meet optimum yields, according to Iowa State University recommendation. And all of the manure was extra, over and above what it would have required. And those counties had the highest pollution rates for groundwater, so on. So, I mean, it's just a failed system in terms of getting rid of the waste, even if you ignore the public health impacts. It's just an environmental disaster. And the city of Des Moines is paying millions of dollars to remove that nitrates from the drinking water. And they're finding out that high nitrate levels is not only harmful to babies and that sort of thing, but anybody with compromised health. But the rest of you can talk more about that. But I just wanted to pass along the agronomic sort of thing. Greg may have other things to add.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick on it. I'll try to be brief. And thank you, Dr. Ikerd, for that. That was really helpful. I mean, it's the externalities we're talking about, right? I mean, so you're not taking into account, if it's a public health model, as Dr. Ikerd just said, totally different approach, right? Totally different approach. It was about protecting public health. So I think Dr. Ikerd, maybe Dr. Lawrence said earlier, the fact that we need to have these facilities in compliance. Why do we have an ag exempt from Toxic Substance Control Act, Emergency Planning Community Recreational Act? Much of this waste, particularly from hog farms, for example, if you look at the North Carolina example, they took the waste from a hog farm and they dumped it on the grounds of the State House, and they said, get this hazardous waste. This is not even Muhammad with North Carolina EJ Network. Get this hazardous waste off the grounds. So it's hazardous waste if it's here, but it's not hazardous waste when it's being dumped in my community, right? Think about that. So you got hazardous waste in these communities, but it's not. But it's seen as a good, right? So we're talking about using it as fertilizer. But when it's on the grounds of the Capitol, it's hazardous waste. The public health impacts, the pathogens, as you said, the nitrogen, if you look at hog farms, like Dr. Ikerd said, it's more wet waste. So you have the ammonia, you have the hydrogen sulfide, you have the VOCs, you have the burning eyes, nose, and throat, right? You have the asthma. You have the fact that you have people at Johns Hopkins like Chris Haney, who's done work with agricultural workers in North Carolina, that's shown that they can actually trace the DNA out of the gut of a pig. So they can trace pig crap literally on the surfaces of your house. Pig crap should not be in my house. They can track that DNA now. That the science is showing this the level of intrusion and exposure and impact on people's local environments and on people's health. So we need to have more compliance with the Clean Water Act, with the Safe Drinking Water Act, with the Clean Air Act. There's no reason why these facilities should be exempted. I mean, I'm not a supporter of oil and gas industry. I'm not a supporter of a power plant. I'm not supportive for a sewage treatment plant. But if they got to comply with the Clean Air Act, these large-scale facilities also should be complying with the Clean Air Act. They dump a lot of waste into the air, water, and soil. So they should be in compliance just like other industries have to be in compliance. So I'll stop there because I'm getting heated. But yes, really good point. Rest of the panel, there you go.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
Yeah.
And I want to say one last quick thing, just to show you just how exempt and how much leeway the poultry industry is given, especially in an area like here on the Eastern Shore. When this waste is applied, even though it's dry litter, that is still potent. We have an elementary school, because we talk about these CAFOs being dangerously close to schools and homes and playgrounds across from my daughter's school. We had a school, from them applying the manure, got the entire school of kids sick. The entire school, elementary school, the kids were throwing up. It was so bad, it was so heavy that the whole school, the kids were throwing up. What did they do? They brought in some fans and they bloom around the school, and maybe that'll help. And they did not call one parent. A parent found out about it on Facebook. Okay. And this is the kind of ridiculousness that this industry is given, the double standard, as Dr. Wilson was just saying, it's a double standard.
And just to chime in real quick, I know this is, I don't want to keep going, but this in my head about the early issue that I think Greg talked about, resiliency. This is a homeland security issue, right? This is a safety and welfare issue. And the reason why I make that point is, and I don't want to be remiss if not talk about hurricanes. Think about the hurricane season, right? These facilities are in areas that are already prone to flood. They're near sensitive rivers and streams. I look at Hurricane Florence that hit North Carolina in 1999, right? And then Hurricane Florence, I'm sorry, in 1999. And then 20 years later, you had Hurricane Florence, dumped, was 11 trillion gallons of rain. And so people were escaping from that event through toxic soup of animal waste, dead animals, human waste, and coal ash. That's a homeland security issue. It's an emergency response issue too. So I think there needs to be more thought taken too about how we, as Greg talked about, make this industry more sustainable, as Dr. Ikerd said, but also when it comes to these issues of hurricanes and natural disasters. So that's another angle we have to think about, and the reason why this industry needs to be transformed. And as Maka mentioned, in North Carolina too, you had this whole thing about waste to energy. It's sustainable. That's not sustainability, having crap in your neighborhood and then you hosting those lagoons, for example, in North Carolina, and they're making energy, right? They're collecting the methane gas, but you're still hosting it. And then we had a moratorium in North Carolina that was a major failure. So I was gonna say that we wanna have a moratorium in Maryland, but we need to have a moratorium with action and make sure we don't follow the example of the field moratorium in North Carolina. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So I see a lot logging off here. I'm just going to say it one more time. If you guys like what we're doing here, if this is something that you appreciate, we're out here educating people about these topics, out here promoting change, finding solutions. Please log on to sraproject.org to donate to SRAP. We do a lot of good stuff centered around all this type of stuff. Next question is going to be from Catherine Fendrick, and she asked, what PAC or 501c4 do you think is a model for successfully lobbying around these industrial ag issues at the state or federal level? Thank you.
Well, I'll say Food and Water Watch does a lot of legislative. They're 501s. They're able to do that. They're able to lobby, and they cover everything from fracking, pipelines, down to CAFOs. So they are one. Now, with SRAP is great at educating our communities and getting the word out and supporting our grassroots organizations and empowering people so that they can take up their causes with legislators and start that process. But I know Food and Water Watch does a lot of lobbying specifically. They're able to do that. As well as oh, go ahead, Dr. Ikerd.
No, I was going to say that there's also state level organizations I mentioned, like in Iowa, we have Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement that are very active in lobbying against CAFOs. And in Missouri, they have the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, who's been long-term lobbying against CAFOs. And in Minnesota, what is the Minnesota Land Stewardship Project? So it depends on your state. I don't know whether you have those in Maryland or Delaware, or the Delmarva Peninsula or not, but the state groups can be lobby as well.
Thank you, Dr. Ikerd. I just want to remind our speakers, guys, if you need to get off, I totally understand. Greg, I know you have a farm to get to in the morning and a lot to handle. So I know you're looking tired over there. Please feel free to get off if it's that time. I totally understand. We told you guys only till 8:30. We are just going to keep rolling through a couple more questions. Please feel free to get off. It's no problem. So the next one's actually a pretty interesting one. This is about resistant bacteria or viruses. They ask with the current pandemic's origin, this is from Angela, NCDAS, the current pandemic's origin is said to have originated in the live animal market in China. Those conditions are very similar to our CAFO conditions. How can we be sure that this pandemic situation won't happen again or worse? And I'd just like to start off by saying something about this one. I wrote a huge paper on all I'm talking antibacterial resistance in the CAFOs and whatnot in the industrial farming, because they pack these things in as, as preemptive measures to prevent these diseases, and end up creating highly resistant bacteria that cannot be treated. And then everything becomes more expensive when that leads to people getting contaminated with that resistant bacteria that now cannot be treated in the hospitals. That's driving up medical costs, driving up deaths, driving up sickness. So I'm going to let the doctors handle this one, but that was just my quick comment.
Well, let me take a crack at that, Michael. The two big threats from CAFOs for pandemic illness are the antibiotic resistance that we've already talked about. When Dr. Chang finished her term as Director General of the WHO 3 years ago, she warned that the world faced 3 slow motion disasters in health. And one of them was the rising levels of antibiotic resistance throughout the world. And it's not just in the United States with large CAFOs that the misuse of antibiotics has led to such high rates of antibiotic resistance, but small producers in South Asia, for example, can purchase over-the-counter antibiotics, and they misuse the antibiotics in flocks of 200 or 300 chickens instead of flocks of 200,000 chickens. But the other great risk, which the question gets at, is what happens in the transformation or species jumping of viruses in the presence of confined animal feeding operations. And we know, for example, that H5N1 influenza in 1997, was definitely a product of the mixing bowl phenomenon of influenza viruses, where they swap bits and pieces of their DNA back and forth in the presence of new viruses coming in from swine, for example, and then they meet up with some viruses coming in with poultry, and then the human influenza viruses circulating there, and you end up with these recombinations of bits and pieces to produce things like the H5N1. And then in 1997, there was a virus that appeared in pig farming practices in Malaysia, which were sort of smaller scale version of the CAFO. And the virus called Nipah arose. It had a high mortality rate, 40% mortality rate, compared to the 3 or 4% mortality rate of COVID-19. Fortunately, it was early, it was identified, it was confined to Malaysia. It never got out into large swine CAFO operations in North America and elsewhere in the world, or it could have been a truly devastating thing. And then finally, some of you may remember vividly, because it happened on the heels of the last great economic collapse in 2009, when we had the swine flu epidemic, which while the newly installed Obama administration was struggling to prevent the continued erosion of the American economy, they were hit with this new epidemic of a very, very strong and high mortality and high morbidity rates. But they handled it well, because they mustered the resources of the CDC and figured out the complexity of that particular virus, developed a new version of the standard influenza vaccine, and we were able to contain that. So as long as the CAFOs exist, they will continue to form this function of being potential breeding sites for new combination viruses. But the true species jumping viruses, such as the COVID-19, which almost certainly came from bats, and the bats then contaminated other animals that were in the live market. That phenomenon, AIDS, HIV, was probably, now that we've traced its heritage back, transmitted from lower primates through jungle meat consumption in Africa. And we probably, there was a very, very significant pandemic confined to Guam of cases of severe neurologic disorder that was related to the habit of catching and poaching fox bats, delicacy in Guam. And it was such a delicacy that that population of bats has been wiped out. So the threat was removed that way by species elimination. But this is a very worrisome thing. We should be concerned about these dual threats, the antibiotic resistance and the emergence of new viruses, when you have large, large numbers of animals packed in close confinement, standardized. They've all been bred to the same genotype, so they have very little opportunities for variation in resistance to different pathogens. It's just part of the larger picture that we've been talking about for the last hour and a half of the harmful effects of CAFOs.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. So I just want to be respectful of everybody. I'm going to leave us with one last question. This one is from Shelley, and I think that'll lead us well into, it's definitely for Sacoby Wilson and Dr. Sacoby Wilson, and that would lead him really well into his Justice Symposium that's going to be happening this fall. I'm going to give him an opportunity to talk about that. They ask, if the nitrates deprive our systems of oxygen, does this impact children's performance in schools? Are there any studies showing poor performance in school related to high nitrates in water or ammonia in the air?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm currently working on a project to look at explore these issues in Delaware in response to some concerns about the high rates of children who are in special needs populations, special needs classes in Delaware. So I think, Dr. Ikerd and others have talked about it. I think that's an area that's underexplored, right? So we talk a lot about exposures. We talked about exposures to chemical contaminants, biological contaminants during this discussion, but think about these sensitive windows of susceptibility. And so you can have exposure to nitrates, right? Sort of in utero exposures due to parental exposures. You can have exposures to nitrates in sensitive windows of susceptibility. So just like in the same way, and this is what I'm postulating, just like in the same way, there's no safe level of lead, right? And we know the impacts that lead has on neurocognitive functioning and how it can impact you over the life course. I think there's potential for it to be the same thing with nitrates. So that one way we can answer the question that great question that was just posed, we need to have more studies to really understand nitrates impacts on children and also on our health across the life course as it relates to neurocognitive functioning, as it relates to impacts on development, because that can better inform public policy. So I think when you think about the studies that we've seen so far on CAFOs, there are a lot of studies on air quality impacts on nitrates, a little bit, but we need more studies in these areas to actually inform public policy so we can better protect children, so we can better protect adults, so we can have better regulations around ordinances when it comes to setback distances from these spray fields or spread fields when it comes to schools. Also, it would enforce the need, it would support our statements earlier about more compliance with our current regulatory schema, and also allow us to push back, again, in my comment in supporting what Dr. Ikerd said earlier, a public health model, a public health focus would really help to transform this industry and putting people first, as Monica said, putting communities first. And so I'll stop there, but I think these types of questions are reasons why we have to have discussions like the annual, and thanks for the setup, Mike, the annual environmental justice symposium, because these are the types of questions that need to be answered to inform public policy and to make sure that the communities who are front line and fence line, their questions are answered and their voices are heard. But I think this area, I think there's more studies to be needed. The more studies are needed to answer that question well. But if we can do that, I think we have more data to actually push back again on this industry, because again, we're bringing public health to the forefront.
I'd just like to close out with a comment that follows up on that. Every time I see the Right to Harm documentary, it makes me angry. And the reason it makes me angry, it's obviously that they're depriving the basic human rights of the people that live in proximity to these CAFOs. The right to a clean and healthy environment, a right to, to live, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All of those are being deprived. And I've commented on this before, and I posted a blog piece on my website that deals with this in relation to the COVID pandemic. And this goes back in the country, is why this continues to happen. It goes back to the founding of the country. The Declaration of Independence talks about that we're all created equally, endowed by God with equal rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And it's the responsibility of the government to ensure those rights. But when they drafted the Constitution, I think 10 or 11 years later, they didn't mention the institution of slavery. That was discussed when they were talking about writing the Constitution. It was discussed during the early form. And the reason they didn't, which to me is obvious as an economist, is that the economy of the country at that time and what they saw the future of the country was built on the institution of slavery. Not just the plantations of the South, but the textile mills of the North was all on that. And basically what they did is they give priority to the economic interest of the people that own the slaves, that run the factories, over the basic human rights of the people, in particular the slaves. And that's continued. That whole process of discrimination against racial minorities, ethnic groups, various other people in general know that it's wrong what we're allowing to happen. And I refuse to believe that the majority of the people, I may be wrong, but I don't think the majority of the people in this country are racist or they want to discriminate. But I think the majority of the people so far have been willing to put what they perceive their economic interests to be above the basic human rights of people. And I think that's the reason we see the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on people that are working in the processing plants, people that are in the nursing homes, and people that are in prisons. And those are predominantly people, the ethnic minorities, and people that have been deprived of their basic human rights throughout the history of this country. And whereas we deal with these issues whenever the risk to the economy is current and it's devastating, then we'll put the rights, or we'll put human health above the economic well-being. But as soon as that crisis has passed, then we go back to the same old patterns of discrimination. And what we're seeing is, over the long run, those patterns of discrimination, whether it's against people with CAFOs, people of color, ethnic groups, whether it's women or whether it's homosexuals or whatever it is, over time, that discrimination eats away at the fabric of the country. It eats away at the long run sustainability of the economy, and it'll eventually destroy us if we don't deal with it. And I hope this time we'll pay attention to what's going on and we'll recognize that it's a systemic problem and we have to be willing to bear the short run cost of dealing with that historic discrimination, because to say people have rights when they don't have any ability or haven't had the capacity to exercise those rights, or when they haven't had the opportunity to gain the ability to exercise those rights, it means that they don't have rights, that they've been denied those rights. So I just wanted to get that in before we left today, because I think the Right to Harm film is kind of a demonstration of fundamental flaws within our society that we need to address. And I hope we use this documentary to address those issues.
Thank you, Dr. Ikerd. Just again, thank you everyone for making this possible. Thank you to all our panelists for being here tonight and spending the last 2 hours with you guys. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you to all our attendees for tuning in. And especially thank you to Jack Puccioni for helping us put the whole webinar together and keeping it looking so sharp. Thank you guys. Thank you for being a part of this. I'll see you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Y'all take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.